Well, the first time I met him actually was in 1963. I had gone to the New York City Writers' Conference to be a student of Kenneth Koch. And the conference was put together by Willard Moss. Willard, like James, was a poet, an experimental filmmaker, and a gay man with a wife. And he was quite a crazy man. I went to the conference because Kenneth Koch, who was one of the writers that I liked from the New American Poetry that James was in, was going to be teaching. So I went to Staten Island, Wagner College, and didn't know till I got there that James was going to be there. And I didn't know a lot of his work, but I had read him, and they showed The Pleasure Garden, which was a favorite of Willard Moss. Willard was the one that put the conference together. And so I cornered James and had a nice long conversation with him. This was the craziest conference. In fact, James wrote about it, that being the liveliest writers' conference he'd ever been at. Willard Moss was a crazy man. He and his wife, Marie Menken was his wife. She was also a very important filmmaker. And they're supposedly George and Martha and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Although Albee says they're not, Willard would go around braying like Martha. One night, Willard asked me if I wanted to go with a bunch of them to a bar. And, you know, I was 20 years old and starstruck, and this was like all these people. So I went to this bar. We all piled into this taxi, and Paul Goodman, I was literally sitting on his lap, so he took my hand. Well, I was 20 and just not sure of myself or who I was and all that sort of stuff. So I was just like, this man is holding my hand. What am I? So when it was over, Willard said something to me about he wanted to read my poems. And I thought, oh, well, this is a good way to get away from Paul Goodman. So, stupid kid. I take my poems to Willard's room. He says, oh, come on in. Well, within seconds, he had my pants off. I was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was down there on his knees. Now, this is the man, Willard Moss, who in the Andy Warhol movie, Blowjob, he's the one off camera giving the blowjob. So when he's finished, he runs to the bathroom. I gather up my pants and my poems, get to the door, open the door. There is James and Kenneth Koch, my teacher. They had been listening through the keyhole to my first blowjob. So even though I never had sex with James, he's very much a part of my erotic history. So there's that story. In 1977, I was working in the Special Collections Department when the Kent State University Libraries purchased the James Broughton papers. So almost immediately I started working on them. James was a major pack rat, so he had tons of stuff. I mean, he really saved everything. So it took me well over 2 years because I was cataloging the old-fashioned way at the item level, and it took a long time, and it was not always easy or fun because there are lots of difficult moments in his life. But it was also, when it was good, and it was quite an experience. I think I got to know more about James Broughton than any other person than James himself at that time. I mean, when he would inscribe books, he'd always say to my guardian, my special confidant, you know, because I knew all of his secrets. I mean, luckily I've forgotten a lot of them. But, you know, at the time, I knew his life like no one else because no one else had read all that stuff. And there's a lot there. I mean, the collection starts with letters his father wrote before James was even born, and then goes through family stuff, and then all the way up through, you know, marriages, divorces, love affairs, business stuff, as well as personal stuff. So it was, it gave me a lot of insight, obviously, into that whole San Fransisco Renaissance and that era and all the other stuff. The ones that I remember but don't remember are the Stan Brakhage letters. Those were painful. I mean, that correspondence was just, I mean, some things like the stuff with Esto, you know, I would get so excited to call her Esto from Modesto, you know, and I couldn't wait to read that stuff. But Stan Brakhage, I thought, oh God, do I have to do those? I have to do more of that. I mean, it was just pages of pain, you know, it was just tortured. So I don't remember specifics anymore because I've like tried to block it out, but I remember not being happy doing the Brakhage correspondence. Stan Brakhage was, of course, a very important filmmaker, and I think, I mean, part of it you put from what you glean. I think that they were in love with each other, but I don't know how much in love they were and who was more in love with whom, and they were both married, and it was just painful. I mean, it was just all this angst and all this, what should I do and what should we do? And, you know, I can't even, I'm not even sure that they ever got together, you know, but it was just all this working out stuff. And it was tough going. I think the things that most people talk about, you know, the joy part, what people tend not to remember are the dark moments, and that doesn't get mentioned or talked about much. I mean, the period in, I'm not sure exactly when it was, in maybe the 40s when he was suicidal. I mean, it's stuff that I think everybody goes through, but there's sort of a Broughton persona of, woo, you know, I mean, this big joy is big, you know, and the joy is big, and it's all joy. Well, it wasn't. I mean, he was a person like all people and had to go through lots of learning and growing. And so I think that levels it out, you know, because most people don't have the whole picture of a life. I think a lot of it was not so much an inferiority complex, it was more the opposite, but he always thought he was better than anyone thought he was. And so he was disappointed a lot that he wasn't getting recognition, whether it was for the poetry or the plays. I mean, throughout his life, it seems that reviews were always mixed about everything he did. I mean, there were people, you know, that just thought, oh, you know, here's this great guy who's doing everything great. And then there were other people that said, well, you know, he's too joyous, he's too happy, he's too shallow, he doesn't know anything about poetry, he doesn't know anything about movies, you know, his work is crap. And so you have those levels, and I think there were just moments in his life when it was probably hard for him to cope with all of that. I think that James thought he should really be ultimately very, very famous. And he never was as famous as he wished to be. I mean, he talks sometimes, he actually writes about not wanting to be famous, but it was that kind of thing about, yeah, James, we know what you mean. You know, that you're saying that because it's a good line, but I think he would always like to be better recognized than he was. I think it was disappointing often in his life, and I think that's the moments like when he stopped making film. I think that's probably one of the reasons that he just thought, well, you know, I've done 4, 5, 6 films, and I'm not Maya Deren, you know. So, yeah, I'm sure that took its toll. James Richard Broughton was born in 1913 in Modesto, California. He came from pioneer stock. In fact, he liked to talk about his ancestors coming over in covered wagons. And I think there were things that he was related to Daniel Boone and all sorts of stuff. And who knows if any of that was true, but at least it was part of his mythology, personal mythology. The family basically ended up in California. They were bankers on both sides. Both the mother and father's side were bankers. So his father, also his grandfather was a banker, and then his father was a banker. He apparently had a very loving relationship with his father, Irwin, but unfortunately, his father died in the influenza epidemic when James was only 5. So then his mother, Olga, being a very practical woman, immediately went searching for number 2. And when she found a man, the stepfather and James just didn't really get along. Sonny Jim was one of his nicknames, and the stepfather did not think he was very sunny, or he was probably too sunny, actually. And I think the crowning moment happened when his mother found James prancing around in one of her dresses. And then the stepfather said, okay, we're shipping you off to a military academy. And of course, that was a mixed blessing. He didn't like the discipline of the military, but he did very much like having sex with the other boys. The military academy ended up being very good for James, I think, but not in the way his stepfather imagined. When I was cataloging the Broughton papers, the first big discovery for me was Aunt Esto. She was an immediate role model for him because she was an outsider who achieved great success. Why was she an outsider? Okay, in the family, she was a Democrat and a Christian Scientist, and everybody else was a Republican and an Episcopalian. So that part was there. And then in the outside world, she was anything but a beauty. I mean, she was actually a very small woman. She walked with a limp because she had a problem with her spine. James at one point calls her dwarfish. So she had all this against her, but she had great achievement. She actually is a very important character in California history. She was the first woman attorney in her county. In 1918, she was one of the first 4 women elected to the California legislature. In 1932, she went to the Democratic National Convention that nominated FDR. At various times in her life, she was a suffragette. She was a journalist in San Francisco. She was a playwright in Hollywood. She was on the staff of the legendary Pasadena Playhouse. And then for James, in addition to that role model stuff, Esto was the one that gave James Mother Goose, which was incredibly important to his writing. Esto was the one who took him to his first production of Shakespeare, another huge influence on his writing. And then in 1931, she drove him all the way across country. I mean, they went from Yellowstone to Niagara Falls, from Washington, D.C. to New York City, where he saw his first Broadway plays. I think he writes back that she was a jolly traveling companion. I mean, they really loved each other and respect. In fact, I was so excited. I remember mentioning to James, I said, I think this was a very nurturing experience for you. And he confirmed that it was. In 1935, James was mess boy on the SS Excalibur. And another member of the crew was Emil Apfer. Now, Emil was the great love of Hart Crane's life. And it was Aunt Esto that James wrote to about this. Now, he didn't provide the intimate details of the relationship, but I think it was very important that he knew that Aunt Esto was probably the only one in the family who knew who the hell Hart Crane was. And I think in my mind, and I may be reading too much into it, but we all do that, to me, there's a little bit of her in the fairy godmother in the Pleasure Garden. I think there's some of Esto in that character. James's relationship with his mother was strained, to put it very, very mildly. She was thought of herself as very grand, and she just didn't support him creatively. She wanted him to be a doctor. And I think she said on several occasions things like, "Whatever you do, don't disappoint me, or don't make me ashamed of you." The picture he paints of her is really pretty unflattering. I mean, for instance, his father gave him some books when he died, or part of his gift, or whatever you call it. And there were Robert Louis Stevenson and things like that. Well, the mother just got rid of them. Another one of his great uncle left him some money in a will. Olga cashed the check. I mean, there were all these instances of things. So I think it just wasn't a nice relationship. The Potted Psalm was James's first film, 1946, and it was a collaboration with Sidney Peterson. Apparently, at the end of that process, James had to go out of town, and when that happened, Peterson just recut the film. This did not make James happy at all. The film ended up being shown a lot and had sort of a following. It was his first time out, and his name was there, but he never was happy with it. So he wanted to do another film. He wanted to do his own film. So what happened was there was a man named Frank Stoffaker who was, I think, at the Art Institute, was a young friend. And he had this old Bolex, which actually had been through the war. And James wanted to borrow that to make a movie. And Stoffaker said, "I'll let you have it if I can be the cameraman." So that was great. So he began work on his first solo film, and it was called Mother's Day. And I think somewhere along the line he says, "It's about my mother complex." The two items that I remember specifically that are autobiographical, one is the mother character sort of preening in front of a mirror. And that was his boyhood memory. He always remembered that his mother, who loved to get dressed and be very fashionable, would spend hours in front of the mirror. And so that comes across. And then the other thing I remember specifically is when his mother has this sort of Tennessee Williams line, "I could have had the pick of all my beaux." And I think that line, close to that line, is in the film as well. Mother's Day is just, it's like a lot of his films. It's a romp. I mean, it's basically the mother character is there with a change of costumes every scene. I mean, she's constantly wearing new things. In fact, I think one of the people involved had her mother or grandmother or aunt or something had this historical hat collection. So they had all these hats from all these years, and in every scene, the mother character would be wearing a different hat. And then there were the beaux, the ones that would come. One would bring chocolates, another one would bring this, another would bring that. And so it was just a short, light little thing, which was kind of a memory play in a way, I guess. I mean, this was really his first film, so first works of most people are autobiographical. So I think, he had very specific things he wanted to deal with. And I can't remember now, I think his mother was dead because this was 46, and I think she died in about 39 or something like that. So he didn't have to worry about her. So he could get everything off his chest that he wanted to. And it wasn't, it's a light film, so it's not like it was an indictment. I mean, it's about his mother. James at one point says that all his movies are about play. I think if you look carefully enough, and sometimes you don't even have to look too carefully, I mean, obviously the play element is there from the very beginning in all of them. Well, I don't know the psychological ramifications of adults doing children's things, except that James liked that. I mean, I think James all his life had a childlike component, and I think it's the idea of the innocence of children that we lose, and that the poet is able to either hold on to that or at least reestablish it. And so I think that that's one of the things that goes through all of his work. At that time, there weren't a lot of filmmakers. I mean, it was a time when it was still, I mean, he was a pioneer, certainly a pioneer in that area. I don't know of a lot of other people that were doing. I think Peterson continued, and there were people in and out, you know, that would film but not necessarily be there. So I think certainly for his time, he was a pioneer. Kermit Sheets was an actor and a producer, theater producer in the Bay Area. Pauline Kael was actually James's roommate at one time, and she was working at a store, one of the big department stores, Brentano's. Kermit was also working there, and so Pauline introduced James to Kermit, and then Pauline got out, and Kermit became James's roommate at that point. And it was a long relationship in which they really collaborated. Kermit was an actor in a lot of the films. He played Looney Tom. He was in The Pleasure Garden as well. He played this sort of Western. He's the one American. The Pleasure Garden is very much, James says it's about British silliness. But there's this one American moment in which Kermit is this cowboy who's singing, you know, Gene Autry type. Kermit gets billed every once in a while as sort of either assistant director or someone who collaborated on a script. So they'd had a long relationship throughout all that. And then when they, after their 5 years in all over Europe, when they come back to San Francisco, they move into a place, and Kermit decides that he wants to make a book of The Playground, which is a play of James's. I think he calls it A Precarious Tale for Grown-Ups, something like that. And what Kermit wants to do is actually print it. So they get a press, and they're paying $25 a month for this little apartment, and for an extra $5 they get to use the basement for the press. So the typeface they have is called Centaur, so they call it Centaur Press. And the first book is James's book. They also got some type from Anais Nin, interestingly enough, that she had used for some of her books. She gave it to them. They were going to actually publish part of the diary. She had given them the very first part of the diary, and then she took it back. But she was involved in their life at that time, and they published, they published work by Duncan. Robert Duncan. They did quite a bit of printing. Those 15 years when he wasn't making films were not unproductive years. I mean, he was doing plays that were being produced. He was printing. I think Anais Nin was the one that said every poet should have to put their lines in type, because you need to feel the words. And James's response to that was, yes, after he did that, he said, then I learned how to edit myself down, because he knew he had to do all that. I mean, nowadays with digital, nobody knows about type. But yeah, the Centaur Press went out in that time. That was Kermit behind that. I think in the arc of James's life, probably there was Kermit and then there was Joel. I mean, at least my reading. I don't think there are any hidden ones in there among the men. I'm not talking about Susanna and Pauline and the women. Well, maybe I'm talking about all of them. I'm not sure. But it seems to me that when he reflects about his life, probably the two great loves are Kermit and Joel. Pauline Kael was the roommate, and she wanted to have a child. And she decided that James was good looking and James was bright, and so James could father this child. And so there was a daughter. But I don't think James really had anything, I think they moved out, and I don't think James had anything really to do with the daughter. Well, legend has it, about 1950, James goes to New York with Kermit. Cinema 16 was going to be showing Mother's Day. And they ask the film historian Parker Tyler to introduce the film. Well, one should never ask a historian to do something like that, because what he did apparently was to start to lecture about the history of film or whatever. Well, the audience was waiting to see a movie, so it went on, and it went on, and it went on, and the audience was getting... Finally, they started heckling Tyler. Well, Maya Deren, the queen of the underground cinema, jumps up and berates the audience for, how dare you do this to this distinguished man. Well, this just inflames the audience, and so they start heckling Maya Deren. So then Willard Moss jumps up, and he says, don't do this, this is this great woman. So anyway, by the time they show the film, there's hardly anyone left in the audience. James and Kermit sailed for England at the end of summer 1951. The political climate in the United States was not good for artists because of McCarthyism. But I think basically the reason they went is James had submitted all 4 of his films to the Edinburgh Film Festival, and very much to his surprise, all 4 get accepted. And kind of the hit, I guess, of the group is Mother's Day. Now, Mother's Day was done in 48, so this was 51, but, things were different then. There weren't that many experimental films, so that wasn't unusual. So they went basically for the film festival, and then after the festival, he decided that he really wanted to stay on in England and that he wanted to make a movie. Now here it gets a little dicey. The story James wants to tell is that the British Film Institute suddenly had money to give to a foreigner to make a movie. But then there are other people who think that James just badgered his friends for funds. So somewhere in there it happened. But the film that got to be made is called The Pleasure Garden. And The Pleasure Garden is really the first or the most commercial film that James Broughton ever made. He had been working in 16 millimeter. This was 35 millimeter. His producer was Lindsay Anderson, who became one of the best British directors of his generation. I mean, he has a long string of films from This Sporting Life all the way through The Whales of August, a long career. He was working with a legendary cinematographer. Walter LaSalle shot everything from The Taste of Honey to Tom Jones before winning the Oscar for Zorba the Greek. The cast was mostly professional. It was headed by a woman named Hattie Jacks. She was a beloved figure in British comedy. She was in the Carry On series. And there's a very sensitive performance by Jill Bennett. Jill Bennett was a haunting and haunted actress who later went on to co-star with Bette Davis in The Nanny. She had a tempestuous marriage to the playwright John Osborne, and she committed suicide. Her ashes were actually scattered in the Thames by Lindsay Anderson. Anderson himself has a cameo in the film, and if you look very carefully, I'm sure that we see James Broughton briefly in what I think is his very first on-screen appearance. So it was a big film for him. It was shot in, there was an exposition many years ago that had this big thing called the Crystal Palace, and it was basically in ruins. And Mary Lee Settle, the novelist who also appears in the film, took him there, and he said, oh, I want to make a movie here, so it was just perfect, So they shot with all these, there were weeds and ruins, and it was just a perfect setting. Didn't have to worry about art direction. It was all there. To me, the film is about yearning. There are all these people that sort of want things, either want things they can't have or really are yearning for something. And then what happens is suddenly there's this fairy godmother, played by Hattie Jacks, in the memory of Aunt Esto, I do believe. And she has this magic stole, and she just puts that around places. And so she's able to transform the bleakness of reality into sort of the joy of fantasy. So these people are having kind of mundane lives, and then she just goes around with this little thing and puts it over them, and whoa, they're Tristan and Isolde, or they're Romeo and Juliet, or they're whatever. It's magic time. The man at the beginning is this very dour kind of person who he puts up signs saying you can't do this. He's Mr. Negative, and he goes in this big car and goes to town, and that's where the fairy godmother comes out of her little shop, and she says sort of to herself, oh my God, what's he done now? So she has to undo all the negativity. After the film festival, he really wants to make a movie in England, and it's unclear to me exactly how that comes about. Sort of the official story is that the British Film Institute very mysteriously and suddenly has money to give to a foreigner to make a movie. But there are some people, I think, that would think that James just badgered his friends for funding. So it could be part of one, part of the other, could be either. I'm not sure what it was. But the important thing is he got the funds basically to begin making The Pleasure Garden. The Pleasure Garden is like all Broughton projects, very mixed reviews. But it gets accepted at the Cannes Film Festival. So James goes off to France. He describes the screening as not what he would want. He didn't think the screening went very well at all. So he was pretty much astonished when the film wins this special award for poetic film. And on top of that, at the ceremony, he's presented this by Jean Cocteau, who is one of his cinema heroes. And Cocteau kisses him on each cheek, so he's very happy. Well, I'm sure it was a high point in his life, yeah. They lived around a lot of places. They were in Paris for a while, where he knew James Baldwin, and I think he met Jonathan Williams for the first time in Paris. They were in some beach place where Auden was. They didn't live anywhere for very long. They were in Italy. I think altogether it was something like 5 years that they were in Europe altogether, from England to France, to Italy, to this place, to that place. They were slightly nomadic. I think that James had the feeling he was more recognized in Europe than he was in the United States, so he was happy to be there. People wanted to publish his work. He tells lots of stories about the famous magazines of that time wanting to publish him. And it was like, he'd finish something on the typewriter and give it to this editor. You can't ask for anything better than that. So I think for the most part, even though I think they were short-funded, but, they were, not young, but still young enough to be able to do that bohemian life. And I think that that's something all artists strive for and need, and that was his bohemian moment. The Pleasure Garden didn't particularly do well in the United States. And it's hard to tell because we're so used now to the popularity of independent film, underground film, avant-garde film, whatever art film. But in those days, it was new. It wasn't something, you didn't go to the corner film, and when Betty Grable wasn't on, they weren't showing James Broughton movies, so it wasn't like it got shown a lot. And even the festival scene was not in the United States like it is today. I mean, now, someone cranks out a little film on their iPad, or iPhone or whatever, and it's in a film festival the next week. Well, they didn't have that then, so it would be in a small audience to start with, and then there were a lot of people that just didn't like his films. They thought they were, we talked before about his nickname as a kid being Sonny Jim. His films were too jolly. A lot of people thought that there had to be a lot deeper stuff going on in that film world. And The Pleasure Garden, again, is about play and it's a romp like a lot of the films. So I don't think it did well at that time. Because he won the prize at Cannes, he was offered to direct a commercial film. Now, this is an absolutely critical moment in James Broughton's life. He already had a taste of Hollywood. When he was in his 20s, he was like one of the bright young things in Tinseltown. He lived behind Grauman's Chinese Theater in a little room next to Faulkner's girlfriend. He was a friend of the very celebrated costume designer Howard Greer. He socialized with Jack Soden, who lived in that famous Lloyd Wright house on Franklin. He was palling around with the popular Sunset Strip pansy artist Bruz Fletcher. I mean, he had a taste of that kind of the glamour part of the Hollywood life, so he knew that. But commercial filmmaking is about collaboration, and he had been stung already by the Peterson thing with the potted psalms. So he was very leery. So this was like a crossroads for him. I mean, he could have taken off in one direction, but he took the poet's road. And Pauline Kael said to him, "This is the biggest mistake you've made in your life." I think he didn't agree with Pauline Kael at all. I think he realized he wasn't going to be Steven Spielberg. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. And even if he didn't get the recognition always that he thought, he wanted control. And he made the life he wanted creatively. So that moment was absolutely crucial. And so what happened, of course, is he came back to California, and he just didn't do film. He didn't do film for 15 years. He concentrated on his writing. Luckily, he came back at a time, it was being called the San Fransisco Renaissance. There was this big flowering in the Bay Area of stuff that was going on all over. And he worked as a playwright and as a poet, and he and Kermit printed things on the Centaur Press, and he was very involved. He was part of this group called the Maidens. The Maidens was a group of 6. There was Robert Duncan, his boyfriend Jess, Helen Adam, Madeline Gleason, Eve Treem, and James. And what they did is they would get together every once in a while to socialize and to read and talk about their work. So it was a really fascinating kind of thing because they were all just fascinating, interesting people who were doing good stuff, and they shared that. And I think that juiced them all up, you know. So that was going on at that time, and I think he was very much a part of that. I mean, he lucked into it. I mean, he wasn't saying, "Oh, I'm going to go to be part of the San Francisco Renaissance." It was just that he went back to San Francisco and it was going on. He had a lot of those same poetic friends, and so he just reestablished that, but I think maybe on a deeper level. I guess it would be like maybe poetry workshops today, you know, but on a high level when you're talking about, you know, going mano a mano with Robert Duncan, you know, I mean, that's heavy stuff. James hadn't made a movie in 15 years. And then it's one of these magical confluences. Basically, three things, I think, came together. The primary one was the director of the Belgian Cinematheque contacted James and said, "I'm planning a world film exposition, and I want a new work from you." He followed that up by actually sending him film stock. It was color stock, even. At the same time, James was working on a play called Bedlam, which was sort of about the roles that beds have in our lives. So that was percolating. And then on top of all that, we have another Frank Stoffaker moment. There was this guy named Bill Deloge who suddenly appeared and said something like, "Hey man, if you decide to make another movie, I'll be your cameraman," you know. And so this all came together, and James then came up with this film, which turned out to be his most popular film ever. It's called The Bed. Now, The Bed was shot in 1967 in a place called Druid Heights, which was near where Alan Watts lived. Now, in the Pleasure Garden, we had mostly a cast of professional actors. But what James decided to do in The Bed is to tap the cultural community of the Bay Area. So we have this amazing cast. I mean, there's the philosopher Alan Watts, there's the photographer Imogene Cunningham, there's the astrologer Gavin Arthur, there's the dancer Anna Halprin and her entire company. And then Michael McClure adds a very interesting footnote. Richard Brautigan filmed a scene, but the scene was cut from the final film, which really pissed off Brautigan, apparently. I don't know, it'd be interesting to see if that film exists anywhere, if that footage. I bet, because he did say, I remember when we got the collection, he had lots of little spools of outtakes. The film, as I mentioned what was going on in this play, it's what happens in a bed. You're born, you conceive, you have a lot of fun, and you die. So it's the basic things that happen in a bed, and he tries to tell all of that. This film just comes out at absolutely the right time. We're talking 1968. So we've got Haight-Ashbury and all that kind of stuff. The counterculture goes crazy over this movie. First, you've got a bunch of naked people. Well, you didn't see naked people in most movies, so you got that. There's a pot smoking scene. What kind of movie has pot smoking scenes? There are little psychedelic moments. I mean, it's just the perfect film for the time. So it goes gangbusters. I mean, it's got midnight screenings, it's got film festival screenings. It's just his biggest success ever. And I think to this day, it's probably his crowning achievement as far as popularity. I mean, people that don't know James Broughton probably know The Bed. I mean, it's just one of those films that was immediately successful and has sort of continued to resonate with a lot of people. I mean, a lot of them are old hippies that just remember. You say, "Oh, yeah," but I'd be interested to see what young people think of it. I don't know that, but I think it still gets screened. It's a big achievement for him. I remember The Bed. Being an old person, I remember The Bed when it came out, you know, and it was one of those films. And as we said about the nudity, you just didn't see that in movies. And so it was incredibly titillating. I mean, to see everything going on, you know, I mean, it was, and this was on campus, you know, experimental films being shown on campus. And he says, oh, come on, we're going to see all these naked people. So it was just, kids loved it. I mean, it was just a very, very popular film. I watched it again recently. It's the first time I've seen it in a long time. And in one way, it's funny how tame it is. I mean, because it was so forward-looking, you know, in its time. But I don't think it's particularly dated. I mean, I think it's a very charming film, and I think it works on its levels. I don't know the difference. It's hard, you know, it's just hard to, because you're a different person. I mean, it's a different movie and you're a different person. I mean, that's a long time ago, from '68. So, but I enjoyed seeing it again. It brought back a lot of memories. I love the Imogen Cunningham things. I mean, she, at the time this was made, she was just a very old, wonderful looking woman, and she just comes out in this sort of flowing white gown, and she's just, she's maternal, and she's evanescent, and she's, there's almost a little bit of Lillian Gish in her, you know. I mean, she just, it's just simply gorgeous. That shot of, she's actually in two little sequences. I mean, to me, that just is, you know, I think that's just lovely. That sequence is lovely. Oh my God, is that the one where the guy shits? What would I want people to know about James Broughton? Part of it is the perseverance of the artist. I think that those of us who create want to do what we want to do, and it's not always easy. And I think James did basically what he wanted to do in his life. We were talking about that critical moment when he could have been, you know, the next Academy Award-winning director. But no, that was not where he wanted to go. He wanted to make the kind of film he wanted to make. And the same thing with the poetry. He wrote what he wanted to write, and a lot of people don't like his poems. I mean, really. I mean, there were times, you know, when Duncan was just, I mean, he would just say, "You don't know anything about poetry. Why are you writing this crap?" You know, I mean, not in those words, but that's what he meant. I mean, there was a lot of friction in that relationship. It all got resolved. But, I mean, there were a lot of people that always felt that James was light in the loafers and not artistically. And I think he still had the vision. He knew what he was doing, and he knew the complexities of the simpleness. Part of it, I think, came from his study of Zen. Part of it came from Mother Goose. Part of it came from a lot of different areas. But he had this voice that was really unique. One of the things that happens with him is, and I think that one of the reasons he's not written about as much or talked about as much is because he doesn't fit in. I mean, he's not one of the beats. I mean, he was involved peripherally with the beats, but he's not a beat poet. He's obviously not New York school poet. I mean, where does he fit in? He's so unique, and that's, for him and his career, is probably a blessing and a curse, depending on which way you look at it. I mean, there's some people that just dismiss him because he's there. He's all by himself there. Now, there are other people who think, oh, wow, that's pretty good. You know, you're there. You're it. So I think that that's the thing that that I would like him to be remembered for, is that if you have a vision, stick to it. You are just who you are, and you need to show that in your work. You know, don't try to be someone else. Don't try to say, okay, because this is popular. I mean, he tried writing novels. He tried writing Broadway plays. He had that little flirtatious moment with being a big movie director. He realized that that wasn't him. That wasn't where he needed to go or wanted to go. And I think he was true to that. I think the first time I was with James back in '63, it was like a fan, you know, like an awestruck kid. I mean, I was 20 and he was whatever. He was, well, 63, he would have been 50. That seemed old. I mean, when you're 20, 50 seems old. So this is like this venerated person, you know, particularly since, you know, the new American poetry for poets of my generation was the great anthology of the 20th century. So he was in that book, you know, and that was important. I think later on, when I got to know him, I mean, he started coming to Kent regularly in '77, and over the course of things, I mean, he stayed at my house. He and Joel, you know, were house guests. I would visit him here in San Francisco, and, you know, we'd go to the Castro Theater for film festivals and Chinese restaurants and all that kind of stuff. So over the years, I got to know him, and it was a feeling of a little more of equals. I mean, obviously it was a different generation, but at least we responded to each other, I think, in an evolving kind of way. So it was, I mean, I mostly enjoyed being with James. There were moments when it wasn't always easy. And part of that was because I was in a position that could benefit him in a way. And he had a neediness at times, and there were moments when, you know, I thought, James, you're just pushing a little here, you know. But, you know, we all do that. So. Richard Myers is a filmmaker at Kent State, and Richard loved James and loved his work and brought him to campus often. So he was making, I think this was 1981, and he was doing a film that ended up with the title Jungle Girl. And James was going to be a ventriloquist. And there were a whole group of us that were just sort of there, and they suddenly needed a dummy. And I thought, if I'm the dummy, I get to sit on James's lap, I'll have more film time. So I said, I'll be the dummy. So I got to be James's dummy. So that was fun. I mean, that was fun. He took direction very well. Then the one other time, later on, it didn't work. There was a scene that, for a film that Richard was using this long dolly shot, and I was, again, I was very savvy about these things. I knew if I got right next to James, I'd be in the film more, so I got right next to James. But they didn't use that footage at all. It was sort of like Broughton in the bed, you know. We got cut too. So even James Broughton got cut. That's life.